I am so excited that we are into season 3 of my podcast, Stories of Unconscious Bias. When I first began this podcast, I had no idea that it would take off. I began it because I genuinely want more people to listen, reflect, and learn about how our life experiences can influence us in ways that we cannot begin to imagine. Due to the wonderful candid stories my speakers have shared, I now know that my podcast is ranked in the top 5% globally. I want to thank all my speakers for this huge achievement. As always, if you enjoy it, please do share, rate, and review. Thank you for listening. Welcome, listeners. I'd like to introduce Anna Harrington. Anna Harrington grew up in the 70s in a white middle-class area on the Pennines, an area juxtaposed to the multicultural population of Oldham. She's adopted and mixed race. She has both benefited from white privilege and experienced racism throughout her childhood. This has allowed her to viscerally recognize the effects of not fitting in and how the social environment influences behaviours. She now has her own business advising on how to enable employees to be productive and thrive through work. So as you can imagine, I am hugely looking forward to hearing Anna's stories on unconscious bias. And I am so very pleased that you have decided to speak with me today, Anna. Welcome and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Smita. It's an incredible opportunity to be able to talk about my story.
So, unconscious bias, before we even talk about stories, you've thought about this clearly. What do you understand by these two words?
Yeah, absolutely. I've spent a lot of time recently thinking about it and trying to really put it into a clear definition that people can, and myself, understand. And I think it's an instinctual and primitive process of observing and then deciding if characteristics and attributes of another person are the same or different to ourselves, and what does that mean to us? What do the similarities or differences mean? And then if it goes unchecked, this then can lead to behaviours, actions, communications that can be of detriment to the person or group. I think it's really, in the last 24, 48 hours within the UK, we've had a spotlight placed on unconscious bias training, and is it actually effective? And again, I've spent a lot of time sort of thinking about this and having discussions with people. I'm decided that actually my perspective is that if it starts people to be able to understand a little bit about this concept and begin to recognize that it is part of every single one of us, it's not something that another person does, it's what we all do, then that's great to me. That means actually that the training has had some positive effect. Of course, the follow-on from that to bring about change is, I think, much, much more challenging, where you need the person, we need ourselves to have self-awareness, to have self-reflection, to be able to hear the stories of others and to hear willingly, and to be able to accept from others that maybe we have caused them some harm and some upset.
This is very powerful, yeah. And I agree with you. I agree with you completely. I mean, also what your comment on what's happened in the UK in the last 24 to 48 hours. So in terms of unconscious bias training, there's no point just ticking a box. It's so much more about genuine self-reflection. And as you so rightly said, I mean, it's a successful outcome if the person has begun, and the begun is the operative word, to self-reflect and begin to understand what that is. But you also used a word which I thought was a very strong word, which was the word primitive. I mean, to me, the way I'm hearing it, and perhaps my listeners are not listening the way I'm listening, but each of us hear things differently, but to me, primitive.
Mm.
It's so primal. It's primal. It's instinctive,
Mm.
and so when what does that really mean? Can you
Yes.
can you
Yeah.
expand? What does that look like in terms of a story you could share?
Yeah, so I wonder, I don't know this, but I wonder whether it is part of our psychological protective mechanisms that actually don't make us more protected. They make us more at risk, more vulnerable. And I think it comes from that. I wonder whether it comes from that sort of emotional part of our brain that is the sort of more primitive and instinctual part, the part where the sort of get a bit technical, but the limbic system where you have your stress, automatic stress responses. That's what what I'm considering and thinking. I mean, it's really interesting. My upbringing was amazing in terms of now when I look back on it, as I see it as a real rich seam of experience. As you started off saying, I am adopted and I'm multiracial. I'm both white and I am Pakistani. I was adopted into a lovely white middle class family. And, I have to really give credit to my mom who did adopt me in the 70s during this time. The very reason that I came up for adoption was because of my multiracialism being a problem. Being a problem to my biological mother's family who were struggling to be able to accept me. And interestingly, as well, the family that I was adopted into, one of the elderly relatives in that family also expressed some concern about a mixed race baby coming into a white middle class family. And I think, that absolutely does reflect the times in the 70s where it was a period of white power, skinheads, real political and racial unrest. Um, and so I was brought into this family who already had two children. They were my parents' biological children, two boys, who very white. So it was also very interesting that when we would go out as a family, I would be stood there with classically sort of Pakistani coloring. I have jet black hair, I have amazingly dark eyes, with my brothers and my parents who were blonde and blue eyed. And it was quite amusing, really, because I could see people looking at us as a family and questions going through their heads as if to say, what's happened with the daughter? She looks a bit different. So, I mean, again, that could very well be my assumption, my unconscious bias, that is what they were thinking. But I don't think that's unreasonable for me to come to that conclusion. I'm an outspoken, feisty person, through and through. So even as a child, I stepped forward at that point and said, actually, I'm adopted, just to bring clarity and clearness of where things were in the situation.
To ease the confusion, really. But I mean, I think it's also important for the listeners to appreciate what the 70s in the United Kingdom looks like, because perhaps everyone doesn't know. I don't want to make an assumption. In 1968, a member of Parliament, an MP named Enoch Powell,
Yeah,
made a big speech, which was called the
yeah,
Rivers of Blood speech, which is a
yeah,
very anti-immigrant speech, and
yeah,
that then fueled and was to a great degree a lot of white people in the United Kingdom in the 70s were, for want of a better word, racist. And
yeah,
certainly the Enoch Powell speech would have been one of the triggers, if not the trigger, to have resulted in what then happened in the 70s. And so now you growing up And
Yeah.
what do we know by Pennines? What does that mean
Yeah.
to the
Okay.
listeners? Is that a very white area? What does it look like?
Okay, the Pennines actually just relates to a piece of land that is hill landscape going through the northern central part of England. But it's also an area that had a lot of textile mills, cotton wool mills, and especially in Oldham. So hence why the population in that area was very multiracial, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi. So the National Front, which was a racist, far right-wing organization, was very, very strong in that area. I went to school, obviously, and from the age of about 7 or 8, actually, I had racial slurs. I mean, I look back now and it's ridiculous, you know, what the other children used to call me, a wog, blackie, nigger, packy. And it was hard because there was no one else of my colouring within the environment. It was also really hard because going back into the family where, you know, you would want and hope to have some reflection, understanding of that, because they were white, they had never experienced anything like this. They didn't necessarily understand the influence of the political and social climate and how that impacts actually on the child. And even though the child is very, very young, the child is still able to feel and be influenced by those factors. I was going to say, we used to be driving along and written on walls in graffiti were "Get Out Packies," and there was the NF National Front sign and packy bashing, you know. So it was there in front of my face. So these words that the other school children used against me were not just words. Words always have associations with them. And the associations that I made with these words were, I'm really not welcomed here. And actually, as I progressed through my school, it became worse than that, where I'm going to be, I'm going to have aggression, physical aggression, and violence against me.
So there are a few things going on here, because I
Okay.
want to just remind myself of what you
Yeah.
said earlier on. The reason you were adopted is because
Yes.
your Pakistani birth mother's family were
Okay.
uncomfortable with you because you were half white.
Okay. I
So
need
you
to bring
then
clarity
is that
here.
correct, or have I
No,
misunderstood that? Okay, if
no.
you could just expand on that.
Yes, because I wasn't clear about what's actually happened. So my birth mother is actually white
Okay,
English.
sorry. Okay, the other way around. Okay.
And yeah, and my father is Pakistani. Now, when my mother, they weren't married. And when my mother became pregnant, he had left the country. He left, I think, about 4 or 5 months later. He left to go back to Pakistan to an arranged marriage. He was of Muslim religious faith, and that's all that my biological mother heard of him. She tried to get through to him, and she did actually send letters informing him that she was pregnant, but she heard nothing more from him. So my biological mother was then left. She was living with her parents, both white and a middle class again area, um, and wondering, well, what do I now do? And her family very much struggled to be able to accept her bringing up me, her baby, within that family, because I was mixed race.
Right. Okay. So I'm sorry. I just needed to clarify
Okay.
that in my own head, because you could so easily think the other way around. I just wasn't sure.
Yeah,
But the
yeah.
point is, so you at one level, your
Mm,
immediate family are growing up with your parents, your older brothers,
yes.
and you are obviously accepted as one of the family.
Yes.
which is, and that's a white family. And
Yes.
then alongside, literally in tandem,
Yeah.
you are in school
Yeah.
and you are having racist abuse thrown at you pretty much all the time
Yes.
because of your looks.
Yes.
So, what
Yes.
does that then mean in terms of your unconscious biases and what's embedding? Because right at
Yeah.
the beginning, when you
Yeah.
were trying to explain to us what does unconscious bias mean, you were saying it's
Yeah.
primitive, it's primal,
Yeah.
it's how. And you also mentioned that what we might do is protect ourselves
Mhm.
from further hurt, and maybe that's not a
Yeah.
good thing. So there are a few things in here that I want to kind of, just to bring up again so that we can explore
Yeah.
that a little bit.
Yeah, of course. So, from my primary school, I then went to a white state secondary school. I've made the point that it's white again, being the only person, or very few others, desperately try. Of course, it's memories here, but I can't remember anybody else of skin coloring, really. And I would also like to, actually, that's another point I really want to bring up and emphasize about this, is because it goes back to, so I'm being brought up in a white middle class family, so I've got none of the other cultural aspects of being of Pakistani ethnicity. So the way I dress, I don't and didn't at that time have a Pakistani accent. I didn't sort of wear mehendi or bindis or anything like that at all. And so it was purely relating to the color of my skin. And so moving into that secondary school, things became things became tougher. To be honest, it became more physical and verbally aggressive, and I felt more and more isolated because I had one friend, and that was it. And then I moved. I mean, again, very, very fortunate. My parents then moved me, not for the reasons that I'm explaining here, for other reasons, but they moved me from that state school into a private secondary school, continued there, but to a lesser degree. And there it was better because it was a lesser degree, but also I had friends. There were two other girls who also were of Indian, Pakistani ethnic origin. And I have to, part of this is about accepting yourself and your own actions and behaviors. And looking back now, I do feel shame that actually I feel at that time that I was so fearful. I was so worried that what already was happening to me, what had happened to me in the past, would become even worse if I associated myself with others who were of a similar ethnic origin. So at that time, I was thinking these two girls who were Pakistani and Indian origin. And I feel ashamed because of that. I feel as though, actually, if we three had come together and supported and understand each other and protected each other, then it could have been, much better for all of us. I have to say that those other two girls experienced extremely vicious racism.
Well, I must respond if you don't mind, because
Yes.
you're saying you're ashamed, but I'm thinking
Mm,
you wanted to stay safe.
yes.
And of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we can all
Mm,
say, I wish I could have done things differently. But
yes.
this comes back to something very fundamental. Who
Mm,
am I? How do I see myself?
mm,
What is my identity? And
yes.
very simply put, am I white or am I brown?
Yes.
That
Yes.
was your two choices. And because you went home to your parents who were white,
Yes. Yes.
even though there were white people showing racism towards you,
Yes.
they, which is I'm really wanting the listeners and for my own self to
Mm,
understand this enormous confusion in your head,
yes.
because we this whole business of unconscious bias, we take our upbringing for granted, We are who we are. We think about, my identity is X, whatever that might be. And
mm,
each of us are comfortable or not comfortable in our own
mm.
identity, whether it's gender or race or religion or
Sure.
sexuality or ethnicity or any of that, or a combination of all of them.
Mm,
But for you, there was a very direct, I'm white, but the white people
mm.
show me enormous racism.
Yes.
And I'm brown, but I better not like the brown people because I will be attacked.
Yes, exactly. And my mother, who, I always used to term mother as the lady who brought me up because that's who she
Of
is.
course she is, yeah.
Um, I mean, bless her. She tried in her own way. So I remember as a teenager, she would try and call me down from my room to show me some documentaries that were about India or about Pakistan or about Bangladesh. I remember being horrified and just screaming at her that no way was I interested in that whatsoever. And looking back, I can now recognize that it was pure fear that at least that's something that I can control. I can't control my skin color, but I can control who I associate with. And so if I manage that, then it's going to mean that I'm safer.
But in the context of unconscious bias, we are saying this is all instinctive. Your screaming in
Yeah.
fear was just, it was, I'm coming back to that first word you chose, primal.
Yes.
You
Yes.
just reacted instinctively. This was your
Yes.
unconscious bias. You had kept it there in what I call your backpack to keep you safe. And you
Yes.
weren't going to have anything to do with that entire South Asian population
Yes.
because you felt that if you did, you would be unsafe.
Exactly. Exactly. And I mean, honestly, I now look at it and go, crumbs, you missed out. You missed out. You missed out that time. Was you can have done gained so much since. But yeah, and like I
But what
say,
about white privilege? Because when I
yeah.
introduced you, I said that you've
Mm,
experienced white privilege. Certainly, the stories I've heard, it doesn't sound to me like you
mm,
had any sort of white privilege. But could you tell us a little bit more about what that looks like
yeah.
in connection to your unconscious bias?
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is something that I've only just actually realized, which again, I'm a little bit shocked that I've only just realized this. So I'm still working through that myself and trying to gain an understanding of it. But my thinking is that why wouldn't I have gained some benefit from it? Because I grew up in a white middle class family, and because all of my behaviors and cultural aspects, the way I dress, what I eat, what I talk about, has that white privilege perspective.
Could you expand on that so we understand that better?
Yeah. So, for instance, I think that I didn't have the racism as bad as those two girls that I mentioned because I didn't have any of the other cultural identities that are picked out and identified as being different, so therefore worthy of attacking even more. So, for instance, they would come into school with maybe they might wear a bindi, or they might have a bit of mehendi on, or they would maybe have the smelling of some home cooking on them, which was different from a white families cooking. And so those were identified more than just me as having a different skin tone and a target, therefore, of more vicious attacks. I
It's
think that's
interesting you
sort of
use the
where
word
I come
privilege, though. But I mean,
from.
because certainly in today's context, since Black Lives Matter happened, um,
Mm,
when we're talking about white privilege, we're talking instinctively about how the white person
mm,
it takes things for granted
mm.
because they
Well,
are white.
mm.
Would you
But
say that's what was happening with you?
I suppose things like I can't say of any instances from the age of 17. So when I left education where I feel that my colour has been an issue. Whereas I don't think that's true, you know, for others who have dark skin. And so therefore I associate that with the fact that, you know, I have none of those other cultural identifiers of being of Pakistani origin. In fact, actually, what started to happen is that people would, you know, they would ask me, what, you know, what's your, why have you got, you know, why is your skin tone? Why are you dark? Are you Spanish or are you Portuguese? So the whole emphasis around it, or the questioning around it, lost all of the aggression. And it became, you know, people would ask me, what is your skin coloring? But it was more a fact of absolute fascination and interest. It was a positive thing. They were interested in it. So maybe, you know, maybe I'm using the term white privilege wrong.
No,
I don't know.
I suspect you're not, because you're talking about really racial inequality and injustice that supposedly white people do not experience as much as non-white people. And
Yeah,
because you are half white, in
yeah,
comparison to your two classmates who were completely
yeah,
South Asian in origin,
yes,
you
they were.
did have a less of
Did.
less racism, and therefore you were to some degree experiencing what you are calling white privilege. I don't disagree with you. I'm just curious to try and explore that a bit more. That's all.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It's something that, like I say, I've just recently um, considered that actually I do have right privilege. So I haven't fully thought out exactly how that translates into reflecting on you know, my upbringing and since schooling as well. And you know, I can't say that I have experienced any racism since then.
But but
Mm,
I just, because your story is so moving and
mm,
so powerful at
mm,
so many different levels, because even the most basic things that many of us take for granted, you have not been able to growing up.
mm. Yeah,
I mean, other than a home over your head and food on the table and loving parents, I
absolutely.
mean, I'm taking away from that, but I'm talking about
Mm.
identity and our unconscious biases and how they're impacted.
Yes.
And
Mm,
so, and you've obviously been reflecting a lot right through your life. Um,
mm.
what can you know, how do you manage? How did you manage then, and how do you manage now?
Yeah, people do ask me that. People who know my full story, that's exactly what they ask me. I think I'm very lucky in that I think naturally I am a hopeful and optimistic person. It also comes down to me deciding what is it that I really want. What is the type of person that I really, really want to be? I don't want to be a person that I was when I was a teenager, when I was so fearful, when I was so confused. And sorry, I'm almost talking as though I am a teenager now. I need to move beyond that. I need to be a person who is confident, who is able to use her natural attributes for the good of herself and for others as well, and wants to live a happy, healthy life. So I mean, I, I don't, there's certainly not a simple answer to that. I think it's again about the social environment that you're in. You know, I then moved into being very much accepted, having great friendships. You know, I have a fabulous husband and children. So people who totally accept me, and who also gave me validation. So when I've talk to others who are around me when I grew up, they validated my stories. So that confirmed that, okay, my memory is not skewed here. So I can believe myself and my experiences, and they also gave me validation about my emotions. So, confirming that, yes, Anna, that it was pretty awful, what you experienced, and it shouldn't have happened. So that, that actually is a huge part of being able to move forward and on. But I also think an aspect of it is about recognizing, as we've already discussed, your capacity. So my capacity to do injustices to other people, obviously not consciously, absolutely not consciously, but from the unconscious bias perspective, I'm being willing to hear and listen to other people's stories.
I'm just kind of bereft of words, but I just want, because you've said some amazing things, and I want to summarize that for the listeners and for myself, because they're all gems. You and I'm going to use the word selfish in a positive way. It's about focusing on yourself and thinking about what is it that I want. It's also that you're lucky that you're born wired half full. And for those of us who might be born wired half empty, which unfortunately is harder work, you've got to work at it to try and think positively and try and change the status quo to make it work for you. But then it's also about self-reflection. And it's about, and what was very powerful is that you're not beating yourself up. You're being kind to yourself. You're not, you had validation. You realize that was not just a figment of your imagination, what you went through as a child and as a teenager. You know that it really did happen because other people have acknowledged that and accepted that was the life experiences that were happening to people like you at that period of time. And so all of these allowed you the opportunity to focus on your priorities, be kind to yourself, be self-aware, self-reflect. That's just wonderful.
Thank you, and brilliant summing up there, Smita. You've brought what I thought was my head mess into absolute clarity there. It's fantastic.
No, I'm just trying to unpick it because I know the listeners would really be so grateful, because I'm sure there are many listeners who are in the same situation as you. They don't have to be in the United Kingdom. They could be born in the US or Australia or wherever. I mean, this podcast is heard in 38 countries, I've been told. And what does that look like? And there could even be somebody in India who might be of Indian origin, but because of the color of their skin is seen differently.
Yes.
The shade of the color of their skin. And then what does that look like? And the racism that they would have experienced. So I feel very grateful that you were able to share these stories with us.
Thank you.
Anna Harrington, thank you so very much for sharing your stories of unconscious bias. Thank you.
Thank you, Smita.
Thank you for listening to my podcast, Stories of Unconscious Bias. If you enjoyed hearing this episode, do tune in every Saturday for a new interview. And if you could share, leave a review and rating, that would be hugely appreciated. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter @Smita Tharoor, and feel free to suggest new guests. Until next week.